Yeah. Thank you, Auntie. So we will look at Daniel chapter 5 today. And like I said, that from chapters 1 to chapter 6, these are very familiar stories. Stories that most of us we would know by heart. We would have learned it. We would have heard about it. We would have even shared these stories. And so our desire is that, we will learn new things from these stories. And in case there are any questions or discussions at the end of this meeting, Pastor Bhagirathi will be facilitating that. Okay. Let me share my screen, and I am hoping that there will not be. Okay. All right. So here we are in the fifth lesson of Daniel. This is chapter 5. And we all know that in Daniel chapter 5, the Bible actually talks about writing on the wall, right? This is Belshazzar. He had organized a party, and then suddenly a wall comes saying that, judgment is due on Belshazzar. And right after that, we know that how the Medes and the Persians take over the great kingdom of Babylon. Now, before we actually look at this, let's continue to read chapter 5. We will read chapter 5, and then I will share a few lessons from chapter 5. Okay. Okay. Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 to 9. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The king summoned the enchanters, the astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. Now, when we look at verses 8 and 9, we recognize that yet again, the wise men, the enchanters, and all these wise people in the kingdom of Babylon were not able to interpret what was being given, right? The divine message, they were not able to interpret. Remember, the first time this happened was in chapter 2, when King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. Then again in chapter 4, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. They're not able to interpret it. And now we come to Belshazzar, and even this divine message, these people are not able to interpret. Now just think about it. All of them were being paid by, by the king. They were on the payroll of the king, and they were basically useless. So in case you feel useless, please don't worry, because you recognize that throughout history, there are these people who were paid, but they were not able to do what they were meant to do, right? So this is the third instance, and I'm sure there were many more instances where these people, the wise men, the astrologers, the diviners, were not able to actually do the job for which they have been hired for. They were not able to explain these divine messages to the king. Okay. Now, from verses 1 to 9, what are some of the things that we learn? Remember that this chapter 5 is in the context of a party, a banquet that King Belshazzar actually holds. And it's very important for us to know the context of this banquet. Then it actually helps us to understand the message that God gives. Okay. So the context is, number one, remember that the banquet was given when the Medes and the Persians were at the gates of Babylon to attack it. Okay, so remember, this is what the Bible is saying, that the Persians, the Medes were actually ready to attack Babylon. They were right outside the gates of Babylon. Some Bible commentators or historians will also say that war had already started between Babylon and the Persians, and yet here is King Belshazzar giving a banquet. It was not the best time to give the banquet. But why would he give a banquet during a war? Or why would he give a banquet when the enemies were at the gates of Babylon? One of the reasons is they were remembering that Babylon was impenetrable. Okay. Now remember, Babylon at that point of time was a very, very secure city. It was one of the most powerful, the most beautiful, and the most impressive city in the then world. Okay. And in that time, any enemies that would come and attack Babylon, it was difficult to break the walls of Babylon. It was difficult to penetrate through the walls of Babylon. So during that war, King Belshazzar gives a banquet. That's not the time for the banquet. Why? Because they gave the banquet remembering that Babylon was actually impenetrable. Let the enemies wait outside the gates of Babylon. They can never enter Babylon because Babylon is impenetrable. Babylon cannot be destroyed. Babylon is the victorious, the head of gold. Remember, right? So King Belshazzar is actually celebrating that military expertise of Babylon. The other reason we need to remember is they drank from the gold and silver goblets looted by Nebuchadnezzar from Jerusalem. Why did he do that? He did that because he was remembering the military strength of Babylon. Okay, so when he's inviting all his people, remember there were 1,000 guests in that banquet. It was one huge banquet hall, and then suddenly he tells them, bring the gold and silver goblets from the that my father King Nebuchadnezzar actually looted from the temple in Jerusalem. Why did he do that? He did that because all 1,000 of his guests, they were remembering the military strength of Babylon. And remember, this banquet was in the context of the war of the Medes and the Persians. Okay, so when they are doing this banquet, bring the gold and silver goblets. The reason was that they were remembering the military strength. My father Nebuchadnezzar, or my grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, actually this was Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar's grandfather, and I will explain it in a while how he was his grandfather and not actually father, what chapter 5 mentions. Okay, and I will also mention why chapter 5 talks to him as his father and not grandfather. Okay, but remember, this Nebuchadnezzar was actually Belshazzar's grandfather. So when he ordered the gold and silver goblets to come, they were actually remembering how Nebuchadnezzar destroyed all the nations, and as a result, Babylon will be able to destroy the Persians and the Medes as well. Okay, the other thing was they praised the gods of Babylon, hoping that the Medes and the Persians would also be defeated, just as Israel and the other nations were defeated. They were remembering the strength of their God. So that is the reason, as they were drinking wine from the silver and gold goblets, they actually began to praise the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, as verse 4 says. Why? Because this banquet was not just a party of having a good time. This banquet actually had military significance because the Medes and the Persians were just waiting at the gates of Babylon to attack Babylon and destroy it. So when Belshazzar invites these people, 1,000 guests, to come for the banquet, they were remembering how Babylon was impenetrable city. It was a powerful city. They were remembering all the military strengths of Babylon, and they were remembering the strength of their gods. And as a result, they were saying, we are not scared of the Medes and the Persians. They will not be able to defeat us. We will be victorious, just as we were victorious in in front of other nations as well. Now, when the hands on the wall come, the king is very scared. Everybody is frightened. Now, the king makes a declaration. The declaration is that whoever is able to explain what the writing is would, number one, be clothed in purple. If you look at verses 7 onwards, 7 says, they will be clothed. Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck. And he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Okay, so this is what King Belshazzar is saying. The one who's able to interpret what the writing on the wall says will be clothed in purple, which is the royal color, would be given a gold chain, and also will be third highest. Now, why third highest ruler? This is where I think it is important for us to understand who this Belshazzar, king of Babylon, is. Why would Belshazzar say third highest ruler? If Belshazzar is the first highest ruler, then whoever interprets the writing should be the second highest ruler. But what is this third highest ruler? Now, this is a little bit of history about Babylon after King Nebuchadnezzar. So once King Nebuchadnezzar died, remember from chapter 4, we understood how Nebuchadnezzar was somebody who finally recognized Jehovah as God, and he praised Jehovah the rest of his life. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar, because of the mighty work that he saw of Jehovah, he praised Jehovah as long as he was alive. After Nebuchadnezzar died, Bible says that his son, his name was Evil Merodach. The older translations call him Evil Merodach. The newer one calls him Amel Marduk. Whichever be it, this is one guy, okay? He succeeded Nebuchadnezzar as king of Babylon. But when evil Merodach became king of Babylon, after that, there were a series of assassinations. There was a little bit of turmoil in the kingdom of Babylon. There was a series of assassinations. And finally, evil Merodach was killed by a close relative. Then that relative was killed. Finally, a guy called Nabonidus became ruler of Babylon. He was Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law. Okay, Nabonidus. Remember, so Nabonidus became the ruler of Babylon. He was Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law. Belshazzar was actually Nabonidus' son. Okay, now here is this what Nabonidus did. Though Babylon, I mean the city of Babylon, where this event is recorded, the city of Babylon was actually the capital of the entire Babylonian Empire. But King Nabonidus did not want to settle in the city of Babylon. He actually settled in another major city, but he made his son the ruler of the city of Babylon. Okay, so King Nabonidus was actually the king of the entire Babylonian Empire, but King Belshazzar was only the ruler of the Babylonian city, the city of Babylon, the capital city. Okay, so Belshazzar was actually just the second in line. He was not the main ruler. The first highest ruler of Babylon at that point of time was King Nabonidus, who was actually emperor of the entire Babylonian Empire. Belshazzar was second in command, so he was the second highest ruler. He was ruling Babylonian city, and as a result, Belshazzar said, whoever is able to interpret will be the third highest ruler. So Nabonidus was ruler of Babylon Empire, the first highest ruler. Belshazzar, ruler of the city of Babylon, the second highest ruler, and then whoever is able to interpret becomes the third highest ruler. Okay, so when the Bible is talking about Belshazzar as the king of Babylon, remember they are talking about Belshazzar as the ruler of the city of Babylon. The king of the Babylonian Empire was actually Nabonidus, and the books of history books actually do testify that after Nebuchadnezzar's death, when evil Merodach became king, then after that there were a few assassinations. Then Nabonidus became the king of the entire Babylonian Empire. Belshazzar was only second in command. So I hope it helps you to understand why this thing about the third highest ruler will be. This is kind of explains where Belshazzar was. He was just the ruler of the city of Babylon. Let's continue reading. Verses 10 to 12. So remember that nobody is able to interpret. And so this king is very, very surprised. He's turning pale. He's very frightened. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. May the king live forever, she said. Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, actually grandfather, that was Nebuchadnezzar, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. Now, when you look at these three verses, 10, 11, and 12, you recognize that the queen is actually coming. Why? Because there is commotion in the banquet. The king is frightened. The 1,000 guests are frightened. Nobody is able to interpret. The wise men, the astrologers, and diviners are all frightened. And then the queen comes in and tells. Now, you will ask me the question, if Nebuchadnezzar was the grandfather, why is he considered as the father here? You know, why throughout chapter 5 is Nebuchadnezzar called the father? The simple reason is, remember, since Belshazzar was ruling only the city of Babylon, Belshazzar actually sat on the throne on which King Nebuchadnezzar sat. Okay, his father Nabonidus, who is actually the king of the entire Babylonian army, he's sitting on another throne in another city. But since Belshazzar was sitting on the throne of Nebuchadnezzar, when Nebuchadnezzar actually sat, he lived in the palace when Nebuchadnezzar lived. That is the reason why continuously the reference is Nebuchadnezzar, your father. Nebuchadnezzar, your father. Why? Because Belshazzar was living in the same place and sitting on the same throne that Nebuchadnezzar actually sat on. So that's the reason why he's called the father and not actually the grandfather. Okay. Now, when you look at these three verses, few things that you need to know. The queen was not the queen that is Belshazzar's wife. The queen was actually the queen mother. Now, why is it the queen mother? Because when you read from verses 1 to 8, you recognize that the Bible says all the king's wives, all the king's concubines were actually present in the banquet. So the ones that the king married, they were all present in the banquet. So who was this queen? This queen was the queen mother who was with Belshazzar in that palace of Babylon. Okay. Now this queen mother knew the past, but never acted upon it. So the queen mother comes and tells Belshazzar, don't worry. During your father's reign, there was a man called Daniel. The spirit of the gods rest upon him. They've heard all of these things. She knew exactly what happened to Nebuchadnezzar because this queen mother was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. So she knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, her father. She had probably heard about the statue of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay. She had heard about the tree. She knew that there was a point of time when King Nebuchadnezzar became like a madman. In spite of knowing all of these things, she never acted upon those things. She never taught the right way to her son, King Belshazzar. And that is something that is very sad because a lot of times we know the past, we know how God worked in the past, we know how God has dealt with us in the past, but in our present, we never act upon it. That is a very dangerous thing. And the other thing that we learn about this queen mother is the fact she took the writing so lightly. She said, don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. Ignorance is dangerous and deceiving. Okay. The king should be alarmed. But because this queen mother herself did not know what was written, she came and told Belshazzar that, Belshazzar, please don't be alarmed. No big deal. Bring Daniel. He'll be able to interpret, because probably she was thinking this would be a great revelation, just like the revelation of his father, right? Nebuchadnezzar, of her father Nebuchadnezzar. He was the head of gold. Maybe something is written in Aramaic. They could read it. They could not interpret it. Maybe something is written. It would be a blessing for my son. And so she says, don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. And as a result, ignorance is dangerous and deceiving. And I feel that a lot of times they say, okay, psychologists say that men, when it comes to men never want to admit that they do not know the way. Okay, that is what psychologists say, that women will at least say, I don't know the way. Men do not want to admit that they don't know the way. And as a result, whenever anyone asks a man, Dada, where is this place? Men will never say, most of the time, men will never say, I don't know. I mean, Janine, I don't know. Usually they will say, you go straight and there is a tea shop. Ask the tea person. Okay, they will never say that I don't know where this is. They will always give some sort of a direction to show that, well, I am aware of it. Okay, but please remember, Bible is saying if you don't know something, just admit it. Why? Because ignorance is dangerous and deceiving. And here the queen mother just highlights that dangerous and that problem, right? She didn't know what the writing said. All she comes and says, hey, don't be afraid, don't be alarmed, don't look so pale. Daniel will come and explain it to you. And when Daniel explains it, then the king realizes that, well, it is actually alarming. Okay. And then when we look at later, we will see how this this message, divine message, was a little different from how the message that King Nebuchadnezzar received. Okay, let's look at the next few verses, verses 13 to 17. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Daniel was able to focus on what really matters, right? He was not distracted by all the distractions, you know, of the purple, the gold chain, the position, the power. He was not distracted with all of that. He was focused on what really matters. And I think as a child of God, as children of God, that is something that you and I should always remember, right? The fact that we need to always focus on what matters. There will be 101 distractions. There will be a lot of these attractions that are actually distractions. But as a child of God, we need to always focus on what matters. Okay. Now, when you look at from verses 13 to 17, for Daniel, this was a very familiar thing, right? This is not the first time that this has happened. It has happened before. And two of the events are actually recorded in this book, that, you know, God sends a divine message to the king. The king gets scared. The king is pale. The king is frightened. Then they call the wise men. The wise men are not able to explain what it says. And then Daniel is invited, and Daniel knows that God will reveal it. And exactly the same thing is happening here. Just what happened with King Nebuchadnezzar twice, right? The divine message came, the king is scared, the king calls the wise people, they are not able to explain it. Then Daniel comes, and Daniel knows for sure that God, who has revealed in the past, will continue to reveal this message to him as well. Okay. Now, when you look at this Daniel, when Daniel was brought before the king in chapter 5, Daniel was almost 82 years old. When he came to Babylon as a prisoner of war, when he was taken, brought captive in Babylon, he was a teenager, maybe 16, 17, 18, something like that. He was a teenager at that point of time. And now when Belshazzar is ruling Babylon city and his father Nabonidus is ruling the Babylonian empire, Daniel was almost 82 years old. He was an old man, okay? But he has consistently served all the kings that he was placed under. When you look at chapter 1 of Daniel, you recognize that Daniel was even serving in the kingdom of Babylon, even when Belshazzar was ruling. Okay. And so when you look at this Daniel, 82 years old, but consistently honoring God, consistently following the work that he had to do, and consistently fulfilling all his responsibilities. Now, Daniel was almost 82 years old. And then the king tells Daniel, I've heard all of this. You can say, if you can interpret it for me, I will give you the purple robe. I will give you the gold chain. I will make you the third highest. And it's very interesting. Why? Because Belshazzar did not know Daniel, even though Daniel was serving in his kingdom. When the queen mother comes and tells about Daniel, then Daniel is summoned in the presence of Belshazzar. Belshazzar did not know Daniel, which again says that Daniel never worked for human recognition. Okay, he worked faithfully, he worked diligently. People took notice of his work. People took notice that the spirit of the gods rest on him. But Daniel never really worked for human recognition. For him, he worked as if unto his God. And that is something that is beautiful. And there's one thing that when we look at the Bible, we understand that when we work for human recognition, many times God may not recognize us. But when we work for God's recognition, many times humans do recognize that. And that is exactly what happened with Daniel. Daniel did not work for human recognition. He only worked for God's recognition. But even his human masters took notice of his work. The queen mother tells Belshazzar, call him. This guy is different. This guy is the one full of knowledge. And remember, Daniel was not in full-time ministry. Daniel was in a political career. He was having a political diplomatic career. Okay, it was a secular setup. It was actually a pagan setup. But yet, since Daniel worked for God's recognition, his human masters also took notice of it. And I think this order is beautiful. First, let's work for God's recognition, and then the human recognition would follow. But if we reverse the order, if we only work for human recognition, if we only work so that my boss will give me promotion, if that is my motivation, then remember that there will be times when God will not recognize your work. Why? Because that is not how God works. And so Daniel is a very classic example. Let's work in the right order. First, let's work for God's recognition, and then the human recognition will automatically happen. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and all his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. One more beautiful thing about Daniel is that one cannot buy or manipulate a committed servant of God. When the king promised all of these great things to Daniel, Daniel says, King, you keep the gifts for yourself or you give it to somebody else. I will interpret what this says because this is a divine message. This is a very important message. Your purple robe, your gold chain, your ranks will not be able to buy this message. This is an important message. You keep your gifts to yourself. Why? Because no one could buy or manipulate a committed servant of God. And I think that is something that is a challenge for all of us, okay? Wherever we are placed, whatever walk of life we are in, there would be people who will try to manipulate us. They may want to manipulate us by making us greedy. They may want to manipulate us by, by maybe pressing on our weaknesses, whatever be it. We need to remember as children of God that we cannot be bought or we cannot be manipulated. We will not compromise. Why? Because we are not working for human recognition. We are only working for God's recognition. Belshazzar only heard about Daniel. He did not know who Daniel was. Daniel was not bothered about it. Daniel anyway worked for God's recognition, and God was recognizing Daniel. Then the final few verses that we will read again. Your Majesty, the Most High God, gave your father sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. This is Daniel interpreting the writing. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was given away, he was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, or bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Now, when Daniel is actually explaining the writing, it's very beautiful because Daniel spends a lot of time in actually justifying the message of the writing, right? Daniel does not immediately say, well, this is what the writing means. Now let me tell you why God is judging you. No, Daniel begins by the fact that, you know what, the writing is a message, but let me tell you why you've received this writing. You knew all that your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar went through, yet you have not humbled yourself. You knew all this. Instead of humbling yourself, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You have praised the gods of silver. They don't understand. They cannot see. They cannot hear. You did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Because you have done these things, then Daniel goes on to explain, okay? He says, therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, Mene, Tekel Parsin. Here is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Remember the banquet, I said the context was that the Persians and the Medes were right there at the gate of Babylon, ready to attack Babylon. And Belshazzar was having this banquet, glorifying the glorious past of Babylon. But here in verse 30 says that very night, the Medes and the Persians attacked under Darius's leadership. They attacked Belshazzar, and Belshazzar was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom. And thus the prophecy that was revealed to Nebuchadnezzar, the first prophecy, the gold, the head of gold was now gone, and the body of silver, the chest of silver is now ruling. That is the kingdom of Mede and the Persian. That was the silver that was revealed to King Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. Now, when you look at this prophecy, this inscription, especially Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, remember this inscription was written in Aramaic. Everybody knew how to read Aramaic, but no one was able to explain the meaning of it, right? Why? Because Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin can mean something else as well. Okay. Daniel was able to explain exactly what God, was giving, the message that God was giving. But Mene, Mene actually is Mina used to be a currency that was used in those days. Okay. Mina, okay, was the currency used in those days. Tekel means has been weighed, and Parsin means has been divided or distributed. Okay. So if you look at the literal meaning, all it means is that money has been weighed and distributed. Money has been weighed and distributed. That is all in Aramaic. The literal meaning is just that. And that could be the reason why the Queen Mother thought maybe it has something to do with wealth. Bring Daniel. Don't be scared. Don't turn pale. See, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, it is talking about Mina, the currency that was used. It is weighed. It will be distributed, divided. Maybe it has something to do with wealth. Maybe God will distribute the wealth of your enemy nations to you. So bring Daniel. Let him explain to that. That is the reason why maybe the Queen Mother thought it could be a very positive prophecy. But when Daniel explains it, Daniel says, listen, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, directly, literally may mean whatever you want to understand, but let me tell you what God wanted to make you understand. Okay, the message that God is giving you, and that is how he says Mene, that is God has numbered your days and your reign. Tekel, Parsin, and as a result, this is what King Daniel tells King Nebuchadnezzar, King Belshazzar. Okay, what are some of the key lessons that we learn? Number one, it is better. That is why Moses prays in Psalm 90:12, right? God, teach us to number our days So it is always good to number our days before God starts numbering our days. For King Belshazzar, we saw here, he did not number his days. As a result, God began to number his days, right? And so I think when Moses, when he wrote that prayer that is recorded for us in Psalm chapter 90, verse 12, Lord, teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. It is always good for us to number our days before God starts numbering our days. When we number our days, we take our life seriously. We want to honor God in everything that we do. But when God starts to number our days, when he begins to weigh our days, weigh our actions, it is a very dangerous thing, the Bible says, to fall into the hands of the living God. We really don't know when our days will come to an end. And that is the reason the Bible reminds us, God, teach us to number our days. A few weeks ago, we all know, it was all over the newspaper. For those of you who know this actor, he's a TV personality, Siddharth Shukla, just 40 years of age. Okay, he's younger than many of you in this group. He may be 1 or 2 years older than some of you in this group. Just 40 years of age. Siddharth Shukla, he was a fitness freak. He had a beautiful body, but he died of heart attack. None of us know when we will die. Today we are all alive. None of us know when we will die. It is always good for us to number our days than God to start numbering our days. And Daniel chapter 5 just teaches us exactly that. The other thing we recognize, the message was in Aramaic, like I said, others could read it, but only Daniel could interpret it. See, a lot of times, remember, if you read the Bible like any other book, you can read it. It will be just like any other book. But for us to understand the Bible, to understand the message that God is giving, I think we need to come before God the way Daniel came before God, in humility, communion, be sincere in what we are doing, recognizing that God, it is only you who helps us understand. Okay, so when we come reading the Bible, to read the Bible, when we come to meditate on his word, I think it is very, very important for us to come with seriousness and not to come lightly as if we are reading any other book, because this is the only book in the history of mankind that can actually transform lives, right? It can change our lives, it can transform lives. God works in beautiful ways through the writings of this book. And as a result, it is a very powerful reminder that people may be able to read anything. When they know languages, they'll be able to read it, but only to interpret it, you needed Daniel, because Daniel had that communion with God. And I think from chapter 5, that is something that we should remember. We should always keep that in mind. Our past teaches us a lot of lesson. Belshazzar did not apply those lessons in his life, and as a result, he was judged by God. Maybe for us, we need to be careful. Since God is giving us this message, let us be careful. Let's live a life of glory and honor to him. Okay, so that's where I will end the study this evening, and I'll give the time over to Pastor Bhagirath.